Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another tutorial for you in my series of gift ideas that you can make yourself. So today I am here to show you how to make a sleep mask,
which you can see here modeled by yours truly.
What you'll need is some wadding. Now, stuffing won't do the trick because you want it to sit flat. This is perhaps a bit thin, but it's all that I've got in the cupboard. So I'm just going to have to cut 2 or 3 layers of it, maybe even 4. So that will be for the inside of the sleeping mask. And then you will need a nice, soft, silky fabric to go on the outside. So this is what will go against your skin when you're sleeping. I've chosen to use genuine silk. I happen to have some offcuts, but you don't actually have to use genuine silk. I do think it will give it a little bit extra quality though. So that will be my outside layer. And now silk is very hard to work with, but hopefully I will be able to give you some tips that will help make it a little bit less challenging. And one of those tips will be to attach it to a firmer fabric and to treat it all just as though it were one fabric. So I'll explain that more as we go along, but I'm using a cotton flannelette, so it will still be breathable and washable, but it's got that little bit more structure than does the silk. Now if you see when I layer them up, you can still see that colour a little bit through the cream coloured silk. I quite like that, but if that's not something you want, you can just make sure the colours match.
Now in this segment I'm showing you a pencil and a pen, which is what I had on hand, but I really should have taken the time to go and get some tailor's chalk because that would have been much easier to wash out afterwards.
You will also need a pair of sharp sewing scissors, a spool of thread and a matching bobbin, some sewing pins. I've seen people use clips before, but I just use these pins very carefully, and if it doesn't go through the fabric, particularly the silk, straight away, I give it a wriggle just to try and get the pin going between the strands of silk as opposed to pulling on one particular strand, and that tends to work for me. Then you'll need a cup or a glass perhaps. I think I'm going to use this mug because the diameter is about the size that I want the face mask to be, so just something to trace around. You'll need some elastic. I've got some knitted elastic. It is supposed to be soft with a gentle stretch, so that should do the trick for this particular project. You will also need a needle. Oh, and one more thing. If you happen to have an ice cream container or a butter container, something with hard plastic, that will help in one of the steps. Okay, to start, I am going to use this wadding and I'm going to trace the size of mask that I want onto here. Okay, so that's one. Now, the spacing.
You might want to adjust the spacing depending on the person you are trying to fit the mask to, but I did mine about 1 centimeter apart, which I felt was fairly average.
Now, for the bridge of the nose, we want to give it a bit of room, so now I wouldn't recommend going too exaggerated, but I'm just going to draw a little arch. Sort of starting to look like a pair of spectacles, which is good because it goes over your eyes. It's the same area, it's tailored to the same area of your face. And then I'm going to just go straight across. So in the absence of a ruler to hand, I'm going to use this pencil. And there we are. You have the rough shape of the face mask. I'm not even sure, I might even put this a bit lower actually. I can always cut it higher if I want to, but obviously you can never put the fabric back again, so we'll go with the lower one first, and if that's not good enough we'll make the higher one. Okay, I'm going to pin these 2 layers together, so I know I will want at least 2 layers of this wadding. It's that thin. And then if I decide that's not thick enough, I will go ahead and cut another 2. Now you'll notice that I'm not cutting any seam allowance. I'm doing that on purposely, so don't worry, it's not a mistake. But I will be cutting seam allowance on the flannelette and the silk. I'm going to actually go ahead and cut 2 more. I'm just going to take one layer of wadding and use it to mark out the shape for the flannelette. Now I'm going to double over the flannelette and cut 2 with seam allowance. I'm just placing it in the middle so there's about 1 centimetre between the edge of the shape, the mask shape, and the edge of the flannelette, just so there will be enough room to cut the seam allowance. Okay, I'll take the pins out, and now I will be using this to mark the shape out of the silk. I will not double over the silk and cut it at once because it is so, as you could imagine, slippery that I just want to make sure that the grain is sitting straight. It's easier done one layer at a time. I'm just trying to pull and smooth the fabric vertically just to make sure the grain sits
nice and straight, and then you'll want to go ahead and pin it very thoroughly so that there's little chance of the grain shifting while you cut the fabric.
So now I feel confident that we've got the grain sitting nice and vertical here. I'm going to cut this one out carefully, trying my very best to keep to the edge of the flannelette. Because this is a bit see-through, I can work with it like this. Otherwise, if it's a bit hard to see through, you can cut from this side. Doesn't really matter as long as you can see what you're cutting. Now to cut out the last piece, I'm going to be using my ironing board. I have given this piece of silk a quick iron, but what I'm going to do to try to keep it still enough to mark a line on it, I'm going to pin it to my ironing board cover. And there we are, that should hold the fabric straight while I use my ruler.
Here I'm marking out a piece of fabric to cover the elastic. My elastic was 20 millimeters wide, and so I'm marking out 40 millimeters wide and 50 centimeters long. I'm doing my best here to work with the grain of the fabric and to make my lines parallel.
So I've got my trusty sewing machine out. It's an old Singer from the 60s, I think. I am taking the silk covered bits of flannelette and I'm going to stitch all the way around the outside, not right up to the edge of the seam allowance. I'm going to sew in the seam allowance just to hold these two fabrics together so that I can then carry on and these fabrics will just stay together as one.
You might notice that I am continually lifting up the foot as I go around the corners. That is because the fabric started to bunch up and shift out of place as I went around the corners. And so I just lifted up the foot, smoothed out the fabric, popped it down and kept sewing. And that seemed to work pretty well.
I've put the sewing machine to the side for now, and I've taken this piece of mask, which is going to be the outer side, the side that doesn't go against your skin, and I'm going to embroider my first name in chain stitch over the front. So I'm going to use this pencil to sketch out where I want the letters. I'm going to choose a thread to embroider with. think I'll go with the dark green. So, with my needles here, I'm going to choose one that is nice and sharp, but one that still has a decent eye to it, in that it's not too small, because it will be quite tricky to get the embroidery thread through if the eye of the needle is too small. What I tend to do is to take a certain length, I guess roughly 60 to 80 centimeters length, and then I take 2 out of the 6 strands, and I will eventually split the 4 again as well, so that I'm only working with 2 strands at a time for the embroidery. Okay, now I'm going to do chain stitch. So anybody who already knows how to do chain stitch, you can go ahead and jump to a later part in the video. But if you've never done chain stitch before, let me show you how it's done. So I'm going to poke my needle through the fabric where I want the start of the chain to be, and pull through gently until I feel the resistance of the knot. There we go. Now I'm going to sort of just loop the thread around like this. Now because I'm right-handed, I'm working in this direction. I'm going to put my needle through the fabric again, very close to where I first came through the fabric, and then create a stitch in the direction that I want the chain to sit, or the direction that I want to do the stitching. So as I'm tracing this little pencil outline, I want my chains quite fine, so I'm doing a small stitch, and now I'm going to pull it through, making sure my needle is over this bit of string. And there we have the first link of the chain. Now essentially we just keep doing that. I'm going to put my needle through right next to where it came out the fabric. I'm going to make sure my needle is over the top of this thread, and I'm going to pull. It's actually quite a simple stitch once you get the hang of it. Now it's probably not the easiest part to show as an example because I'm doing quite a steep curve, but hopefully you are getting the idea. I'm just being a bit fussy where I want the needle. Making sure my needle is over the thread. And I showed you how to start it and how to continue, but it does help to finish it off. So what I've got here is a loop that I've just done. Now instead of putting my needle through and creating another loop, as I had been doing, I will simply put my needle through the fabric right up against this chain link or loop, then pull through, and that just secures it in place. And there you have it. I'm going to trace a line around this wadding onto the flannelette, so that when I come to stitch these 2 pieces together, silk sides together, I will have a lovely neat guide for where I'm going to stitch. Okay, now I will pin those 2 sides together. So remember, right sides together, and then I will pin directly on the seam. And I will also need to, at this point here, attach the elastic. I haven't yet covered the elastic, but I will do that directly after I've pinned these ready to stitch. So we can see that the seam will run inside the stitching we've already got, which is great because we don't want to be able to see any of that stitching.
Now, unfortunately, I must have forgotten to turn the camera on for this bit, but I have just pinned the Long piece of silk that I'm using to cover the elastic. I wanted to make sure that the long lines I ruled onto the silk were perfectly aligned on both sides of the fabric, as these will form the guide for the seam that I'm sewing in this segment of the video. It's also important to note that I sewed the seam about 1 millimeter over to the right so that the elastic would have just a little more wriggle room in its pocket. It's not easy to sew this seam straight, but you can pin the fabric to some tissue paper, which can help you keep it on track.
And now we come to the tedious task of turning this right way out. It's like turning a sock the right way around, only you cannot fit your fingers inside. I'm using the end of a pencil, and that always helps to some extent. I try to stuff it in and then push it through with the pencil. I'm not sure if this is a technique that is by the book, so to speak, but this is what works for me. Will it or will it not fit? I'm so worried. So far, so good. Alright, so I'm going to pin the end of the elastic to the end of the silk and then just do a few stitches to hold it like that. And then pinning the other end as well, just so that the elastic doesn't get lost inside. Alright, now to get sewing again, I'm going to change the settings on my machine. I'm going to go zigzag, and then I'm going to use number 3, which shows this zigzag here with multiple stitches each direction. So that's the one I'm going to go for.
In this segment, you can see that I'm using some pins. What I'm doing is I'm trying to push the seam into the center of the elastic, and I'm just popping a few pins in there so that as I stretch the fabric, the seam somewhat pushes itself to the center of the fabric and is hidden by the stitching that I'm currently doing.
I'm going to change the setting back and then pin the whole thing together. I need to make sure that I mark this correctly where I want it to sit. You kind of want the tension to go right through the center of the mask, so I'm just laying it across and then marking where it comes through either side. There we go. I need to make sure that the inside with the extra seam is not showing when it goes around your head. So that's going to be the outside surface, and so you want right side to right side there, or right side to front side perhaps you might say. That can be slid through. I've got it poking through on one end here. I'm going to firmly pin it. So I've bunched up the rest of the elastic inside the mask, making sure not to twist it either way, and then I will give this one a nice pin in it too, just to keep it steady, and then we're just about ready to sew.
Please note that I didn't actually complete the seam all the way around the mask. I left an opening of about 5 centimeters at the top of the mask for the purpose of turning the mask the right way around. As you sew over the elastic, it's a good idea to go back and forwards a few times just to strengthen the area so that it doesn't tear when you stretch the elastic.
Now for the exciting part, to turn it the right way around. Let's give it a go. I'm just going to quickly slip it on. Make sure it's not too tight with the elastic. If it's too tight or too loose, now is a great time to adjust that. I've ascertained that mine is fine, so I'm going to quickly pop it back the other way again. Now I'm going to hand stitch the wadding to the seam allowance just to make sure that it all stays put when it all goes together. I'm going to clip around the outside just so that the fabric sits a bit better. So I am going to cut this piece of plastic to the size of this layer of wadding, which essentially I've been using as a template. Now that I've got a piece of plastic cut out, I'm going to place this piece of plastic underneath the wadding, but on top of the flannelette, so that when I'm stitching, the point of my needle sort of brushes against this bit of plastic and doesn't stitch into the good area of flannelette where we don't want any stitching. So that's what that's there for. Now I will pin it a bit just to make sure it's even all the way around. Okay, so this is going to be a bit prickly to handle, but I'll do my best not to hurt myself. Perhaps some shorter pins or even some clips would probably be the best thing for the job. Yeah. I'm just going to make fairly large stitches like this, but I'll put quite a few of them in just to make sure it's strong enough to do the job. I'm just going to use some scissors, just regular scissors, not sewing scissors, to cut this plastic down the center, and that way I can remove it from inside the face mask. But I will be very careful so as not to chop any fabrics or threads. There we go. Now that's one half, and there we go. And we're almost done. Okay, so I have just pinned this one to kind of match the seam allowance that I've got going all the way around the outside. And what I'm going to do is pull this over the wadding and kind of just give it a quick running stitch, making sure not to poke my needle too deep because I don't want it coming through on the other side, which is the good side. But yeah, just to keep it attached to the wadding and so that the wadding doesn't wrinkle up and kind of just escape out of the way. That would be a bit annoying. Okay, and now we are ready for the final seam, which is to close this up.
Now, I didn't feel that the footage I took of me sewing up that opening was very helpful, so instead I'm just going to quickly pop a diagram on the screen that I've drawn to try and explain how I went about closing it up without leaving stitching to be seen.
And there we have it, an eye mask. All that remains to do is to give it a gentle wash to remove the pencil marks, and an iron to make sure it's all sitting as well as it possibly can. A gentle iron, of course. There we are.
Well done, you made it through to the end of the video and hopefully to the end of your project. It was a bit of a tricky one this time, but thanks so much for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!